I'm very excited to kick off our afternoon discussions and introduce our next panel, which will be looking at bipartisan solutions to federal cannabis policy challenges, and our moderator, Matt Laslo, who is a veteran congressional correspondent, professor, and writer. Matt, take it away.
Hey, thank you all for having me. We only have about 30 minutes, but then a little longer with Q&A. So to speed things up, I'm just going to let us all do our own little brief bios. I've been a congressional reporter now 2 decades, covering Congress, or covering cannabis for Playboy, Rolling Stone, Vice News Tonight. And then I also am a Wired magazine contributor, covering tech and that stuff. But then I also teach political communications, history of the media, history of the press, looking at how the press and politicians have or have not adapted to new mediums over time. Teach at Johns Hopkins, Boston University, and some other schools. And who are you, madame?
Yes. I'm Maritza Perez-Medina. I'm the Director of Federal Affairs for the Drug Policy Alliance. We're the leading nonprofit in the U.S. working to end the war on drugs. We work on a number of different issues, marijuana being one of them. And I'm the person that's responsible for engaging with Congress and the federal government on our policy priorities, which is very interesting always, especially now.
Hi, everyone. My name's Murti. I got involved in specifically work around ending the drug war back in 2007. I joined SSDP as a student member in 2009. Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the largest network of young people working to end the war on drugs. Joined our youth-led board in 2013 and took over as executive director in 2023. So I've done a lot of work in the cannabis-specific area. I worked on the Prop 19 campaign in California as field director, but my larger scope of work has been very much around human liberty. So I'm a libertarian, that's the background I come from, and so in this and other spaces, I often find myself floating kind of in that bipartisan, nonpartisan space of just trying to get people together to get people free.
And I'm McCauley Pugh. I am a pollster and public opinion researcher for Lake Research Partners. We do polling for progressive organizations and different politicians. So one of our clients is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but we work with different candidates across the country. We also have done a lot of research on different marijuana policy and drug policy. We did a lot of the research for what eventually became the last administration's messaging around rescheduling marijuana. We also have helped with various ballot measures across the country, perhaps most famously in Colorado in 2012. We also have helped recently, for example, in Nebraska, we advised them in their campaign to legalize medical marijuana. So yeah, that's mostly us and me.
And so unlike when a lot of you were here last year, it's a new day in Washington. It is now Trump's Washington 2.0. And as we saw in the last presidential contest, both parties kind of left cannabis out there. Biden didn't embrace it fully. Trump did what Trump does and whispered to many of y'all. But we have a brilliant pollster here. What do the polls actually show us about cannabis these days?
Yeah, so people here would probably be happy to know that it's increasingly popular. Legalizing recreational marijuana has a majority of voters of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. So it is, it's popular. In a lot of ways, it's become a victim of its own success, in that there's no longer the urgency seen to legalize it. You have now a generation of voters who don't remember prohibition. There's just a general perception that the war on drugs and the mass incarceration era are over. And as a consequence, there is a lot more disagreement on what we think legalization, which is inevitable, should look like. And as a result, nothing gets done on the federal level. But I would also add to that, on the local level, for voters' lives, if the consequences are not made clear to them, they don't necessarily see it as a problem. And it's normal we do focus groups and people don't even realize that drugs are legalized, or it's still illegal on the federal level, because they're like, what are you talking about? I do it all the time and no one gets mad at me. So
Bought it at a shop down the street.
exactly. But another way, I guess, to think about it would be, yes, it's popular, but there's a lot of things that are popular that don't get passed. We have all the time ballot measures for school funding, which is off the charts popular. Everyone agrees we should fund schools. But then you get what you call a lot of positives attacks on it. So like, well, yes, this is good, but there's this X, Y, and Z problem with it. Or yes, this is good, but it actually doesn't go far enough. And so in a lot of recent pieces of legislation, like in Florida, it was defeated at the ballot box office because it was seen as helping big cannabis companies. In Arkansas, one of the biggest opponents of it, there was two faces of the campaign. One of which was someone who was your sort of classic person who is against marijuana legalization because they think marijuana is bad. The other person said this doesn't go far enough because it doesn't expunge records, and it lost.
Do you guys have any follow-ups on that?
So many.
Well, just because there's such a difference and just a dissonance between Washington and then reality outside of the Beltway.
Absolutely, and in so many different ways. I think McCauley really hit the nail on the head here that folks across the political spectrum want to see marijuana legal. They don't want people getting arrested. They don't want, they've seen it in stores. The more that they see it in stores, the more they like seeing it in stores. That's what the model that they want. And yet federally, it's still a crime. There was 250,000 people arrested for simple possession in 2023. There's about 3,000 people serving long-term life sentences at the federal level alone, several of whom are within a mile or so of a dispensary that moves more product in a day than they are serving a life sentence on. But the fact of the matter is that people don't realize the urgency around this. They don't see that as the case. They don't understand that this is still happening. And I think it's incumbent upon us to educate people to do that. And so when we're talking to legislators, we see support, again, from Republicans, we see support from Democrats, but we don't see too many, there are some, but we don't see too many sticking their necks out on this. And that's because they don't see that urgency coming from their electorate. They don't think that there's that political pressure that they need to act. And they're worried that whenever they do, they'll be criticized for what that looks like rather than the fact that they're moving towards how it should be and how people want it to be, which is legal. And, you know, that's what we're all here. We're here to educate. That's what you talked about our lobby day. That's exactly what we're aiming to go there and show, is that we have the people care. This is an important issue to all of us, to Republicans, to Democrats, to everyone in between, and they need to act.
And it seems like we've also seen this resurgence of culture wars on issues that we thought were maybe settled, including gay marriage, etc., but that have now kind of been weaponized in the political arena. And it seems like cannabis is kind of getting caught up in that, potentially by the evangelical base of the Republican Party, even though, again, this is a very broadly bipartisan issue. But do you worry about those dynamics, that even though this has seemed to be a settled issue, at least amongst the political class, it isn't anymore?
Absolutely, and I would actually be curious if polling suggests that there's been recent backlash, because what we've had to contend with after this last election is that there has been a backlash on a number of issues, specifically around drug policy and criminal justice reform, and I've been seeing more of that around marijuana too, and I wonder if others in the room have noticed that too. But that does really concern me, because we know that when that backlash comes, it's going to be hard to make any progress, and we haven't made a lot of progress in the first place at the federal level. But, another thing that I wanted to name, I think I agreed a lot with what you said, Kat, that members of Congress, unfortunately, are just not taking this issue seriously. And I do think it's that lack of urgency, which is why I'm really excited that people are here and going to talk to their members of Congress. But something else that I really want to make sure that I name is that we have a Republican problem when it comes to bipartisan support for marijuana reform or support for comprehensive marijuana reform. So it's really important that people talk to all of the representatives, including Republicans, because they're not feeling the urgency, they're not feeling the heat, they're not understanding how this impacts their constituents, even though we know that there's that support for it. And I know we'll probably talk more about, the partisan aspect of all of this, but that's a huge issue.
And I think, Matt, you brought up the culture war, and I think that that's a huge part of this. It's unfortunate, but even though we know Republicans smoke weed, lots of Republicans smoke weed, lots of people who voted for Trump smoke weed, but it's become coded within the culture war as this sort of like liberal left-wing thing. So even though they themselves might consume cannabis, they still use it as this code to push back on. And so I think that that's this other piece that's at play here.
And so I cover Congress. I also have this startup Substack called Ask a Poll. For this community, it's called Ask a Poll Drugs, even though I use cannabis as medicine for my 2 bulging discs in my back. But so last year I interviewed all 100 US senators on the Safer Banking Act, and there was dialogue about it. It passed out of the Senate Banking Committee. Well, this year so far, the PATH caucus, the Psychedelics caucus, has met 3 or 4 times, as Congressman Omar, Congressman Joyce, and Mast have told me just in recent weeks. The Cannabis Caucus has not had one single meeting yet in this Congress. It's just a new day on Capitol Hill. For you, what do you see in polling? Like, what messaging resonates with and cuts across this hyper-partisan divide here in this town?
Yeah, so there's a handful of things. Number one, people think the harsh sentences are just absurd. Number one, that's popular across the board. People really think that it should be that they think that, especially marijuana, it's out there, it's now a thing, and we need to keep it safe to use. So there's like a big concern about people smoking marijuana that's laced with fentanyl. That's
not a thing.
Well, think about who you say that to, because people want people to buy it from. People want people to buy it from safe sources, not from the guy on the street. And so whether or not you're maybe correct, but so making it so marijuana is safe, making it so there's not harsh sentences, tax revenue. When we were the pollsters in 2012 in the Colorado ballot measure, one of the first later focus groups actually we did on that. Someone did not, a handful in a room in the focus group, there were several people that said they did not know that there was a ballot measure on marijuana. They thought it was on education funding. That is how well it was, the benefits of it were defined. And that's something that we kind of need to get back to in some ways. But also, the other thing is validators. We need the validators before the other side gets them, because especially in ballot measures, but also in legislation, when it goes down, a lot of times they have local police officers, school counselors saying how harmful this will be to children, whether it's completely false, but they have good people, not good people, but important. I'm sure they're good people in other ways, but important people saying that. So people who people defer to. Voters defer to.
I mean, so as the representative from SSDP, I want to speak to that youth part of this, because what's really bad for children is prohibition, right? And as we see legalization, or more specifically decriminalization, move forward, young people actually consume cannabis at lesser and lesser levels. It's not just within the United States. We saw this model happening in Amsterdam a long time ago. We've now seen this reflected in states that have decriminalized. However, I do want to bring up an important cautionary tale here. When you see adult use only without full decriminalization of cannabis, we see arrest rates go up for young people. We don't see use rates go up, we see arrest rates go up. Why? Because you're putting a target on their backs. And so I think that is, and we've seen that happen right here in DC. So I think that that's something that we need to be concerned about as well. You also mentioned Path Caucus. If I can just say real quick, we're here to talk about cannabis, but when it comes to psychedelics, they've done an excellent job of pushing back against this culture war narrative. About 4 or 5 years ago, I would say that psychedelics was starting to fall into that same culture war narrative, where it was starting to even get coded as more Republican in the same way that cannabis was getting coded more Democratic. We've seen excellent bipartisan leadership on this, including within the Path Caucus, and as a result of that, we're seeing a lot of great policy wins. We need to copy that model within cannabis and make sure that we can come together and show that bipartisan leadership so that we can get this stuff across the line.
So I have my own bureau on the Hill, and I sponsor, it's called the LCB, Laslo Congressional Bureau. We have a library in the Senate Radio TV Gallery, so when all the anchors are coming down, they have to look at all these books that they've never read and just know that they are doing a bad deed for the nation by not reading and then just spewing to their followers or their millions. But on top of that, we also have fentanyl strips. That's more for the cokeheads in the press corps than for the potheads, but it's still there.
Harm reduction saves lives.
To remind my colleagues of this. How does the movement need to tweak the messaging going into the midterms? I know this new Congress was just seated, it's a year and a half out, but elections hang over everything, and the fundraising still continues on Capitol Hill, even though they have distance from it, so it seems like the midterms are already upon us.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. You know, the first thing that I think of is something that we learned from generally just like the backlash on drug policy reform is that we have to be better about talking about our issues. We have to be more inclusive when we talk about our issues and make it sound like actually everybody does benefit from positive drug policy reform, which is true. But what we found is that, you know, when you individualize, when you talk about, you know, for example, if you say low income, like that doesn't do as well, unfortunately, with voters, rather than saying like we need to make sure that the neediest people in society have what they need. And then not just only talking about, you know, marijuana reform or drug policy reform in the jargon that we often do on the Hill, but like actually illustrating what that means for people.
What it means to their constituents.
What it means to their constituents, like actually painting a picture of what it means. And I think oftentimes in the drug policy space, in any policy space where you have a bunch of people who are passionate and wonky, you end up talking to ourselves, right? Like we end up using the words that people are already familiar with, but just like helping people understand, helping them visualize the benefits of something and making sure that you explain it as a community benefit. An example of that, for example, and I'm going back to like broader drug policy reform, is when we talk about harm reduction. You know, we've told folks now, yes, we want to lift up harm reduction always, but that sounds very like, unless you're in the drug policy space, you might not know what harm reduction means. You got to say, we need naloxone so that if people are experiencing an overdose, we can easily reverse it. We need fentanyl test strips so people can check their drugs before they consume them. We need clean needles so that people won't suffer from infectious disease, but actually like explaining what the policy solution will do. And I honestly just don't think we've done a really good job with that, but I think the messaging and just how we talk about it will help.
You think what we saw in Oregon, kind of winding back decriminalization, because a lot of Republicans have latched on to that narrative, did that set things back for cannabis?
I think it set things back for everybody who wants to see a freer, more open future for drugs and drug policy, right? Measure 110 in Oregon could have been our biggest ever win if there had been more of a movement behind it and behind showing what it could be, behind doing proper implementation and rollout. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is it was passed and then not a whole lot of happened after it. It didn't even get fully implemented, but it became a very convenient scapegoat for politicians who initially were progressive politicians in the area to start blaming for issues like houselessness, like mental health, that have been consistent problems in Oregon since at least the 90s, possibly before, but that's when I remember first hearing about it. Not old enough to know beyond that, but that's almost my whole lifetime, right? And so it's been a problem. It just became an easy scapegoat. But the minute they reversed that, That then became a foothold that makes it not only so much harder for us to pass any sort of drug decriminalization, including cannabis decriminalization, at any level, but also has made it so that the important wins, the victories that we've had over the past decade at the state level on cannabis are now under threat.
Can I just say something about Oregon, though? And absolutely true, everything that you said, but unfortunately, Oregon, there's a lot of things that happened with that. Implementation was part of it, but something else that was also true is that fentanyl finally made its way to the West Coast. So you had a lot of issues, like fentanyl finally made its way to places like Oregon, but you also had a housing crisis that was already in existence, and unfortunately, this Oregon initiative got blamed for it, even though it wasn't fully implemented. We already had the op-ed saying that it was going to fail before the law even passed. Like, they were already drafted. So it really had no chance. But we see this often happen in the drug policy space where we're scapegoated for other issues that have to do with infrastructure and divestment from social infrastructure, the things that we know make communities healthy and safe. We see that across issues, but we definitely saw it in Oregon. And I do want to say that while Oregon was hard, and I say that as, Drug Policy Alliance worked on that campaign. I did not work on it. My colleagues poured a lot of work into that. But ultimately, we did see more money go toward investment. Oregon was at the bottom of the list. I think it was 48 or 49 when it came to access to treatment. One thing that we did see out of Measure 110 is that for the first time, we had hundreds of millions of dollars actually invested in health services for people who use drugs. So, it wasn't a total loss, and definitely a place where I think we could learn a lot of tough lessons. And in fact, on the Drug Policy Alliance website, we have a really helpful fact sheet called What Happened in Oregon. I would encourage you to take a look at it because I think there are lessons we can all learn from it. Yeah.
Can I bring up one important lesson that I think, too, that I think we should apply to everything, and that's the importance of community education. People simply didn't understand what Measure 110 did or what it could mean. There's a lot of misunderstandings about what decriminalization was, what was legal, what was not legal, et cetera. And there's also an element, I think, of overpromising that happens sometimes in the advocacy world where we kind of suggest to people that all you need to do is pass this one thing and then all of these ills that ail society will be instantly solved. And that's not how anything works. There's no miracle cure. And when we do that, it might help you get the votes to pass it on that one moment, but when everything isn't instantly solved the next day, you lose a lot of support. And I think that we're starting to face a lot of that pushback now as well.
I think I've been told to wrap it up, but I cannot wrap this up without talking about racial disparities. Racial disparities, but then also restorative justice. It seems like this is what really dislodged the debate, where you had all these Republicans supportive of safer banking, because they've all heard from their local banks. But then when Democrats are saying, no, we have to actually address the injustices that the war on drug has just wrought on most every community in the U.S., that's where the big divide was on Capitol Hill. How do we navigate that divide, especially going into the midterms, where it seems like the conversation's already been changed away from that?
And that's a really tough issue, and I think about that all the time because even the comprehensive marijuana bills that have had a lot of support in Congress, I'll name the MORE Act as being one example. That bill has passed the House twice, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. It does a lot, including deschedules marijuana, decriminalizes it, reinvests in communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. But we've struggled with Republican support on that bill. That's a largely democratically supported bill. In fact, our one Republican, who I'm very ashamed to say supported it, Matt Gaetz, the piece that he pointed out was the reinvestment piece. He didn't believe in that piece of it. But it's a larger issue in this country. I mean, this is a country that doesn't acknowledge U.S. slavery, that never paid reparations for U.S. slavery, that doesn't know its own history. There's lots of horrible things that have happened in this country that we don't recognize, and we haven't actually paid restitution for those things, especially when it comes to minority groups, Black, Brown, Indigenous. And that's a huge deal, and I think that's a huge factor because we're not going to accept marijuana reform that does not include reparative justice because it's just, but also because I know Congress isn't going to go back for it. They never go back for it. They promise and say that they will, and they never do. They move on. So we need to be part of it, front and center, or it's not going to happen. But how do you do that in a country like this, especially now when there's an attack on education, when there's an attack on racial justice, where they're banning books that teach people more about their history. How do we get past that? I don't know. It's hard. It's a cultural issue. It's a problem with this country, largely, right? It's a countrywide problem.
The war on drugs is racist. I mean, that's just a simple fact. It was set up to be racist. It was specifically go read the history. That is the goal of the war on drugs. That is what we've seen in terms of implementation. But that is a difficult conversation to have with folks, and I don't think it's a very popular one. I do think that anything that we can do to move us towards a more legal environment where fewer people are getting arrested, period, is going to start some of that reparations. But I also think that if you're going to talk about restorative justice, there is one piece that I think that you do have a lot more bipartisan support on, which is specifically that people should not be in prison for cannabis crimes in places where that same thing is now legal. There should be no one in a jail
Amen.
cell next to a dispensary, and everyone can agree on that one.
And I'll add, so like what y'all are saying is very backed up in the polling. We did a poll, this is like 2 years ago now, but I'm sure it's still the same. We asked whether you think marijuana is a criminal justice issue, and there was majority support across the spectrum. Democrats, Republicans, Independents agreed with it. When we asked whether marijuana legalization is a racial justice issue, it had 3% support among Republicans. I don't know, and it had majority support among Democrats. I don't know how to bridge that. I'm not like, I don't have the answer to that. I would say, for instance, we heard a quiet amount during the last election that of people voting for Trump because of the First Step Act. There are votes for Republicans to get on this. And that needs to make clear, and I'm a Democratic pollster, so I don't hope Republicans win elections, but like, there are votes for them to get on this, on a lot of these issues that are popular, not necessarily among their base, but will reach the other side.
It's the First Step Act, and it's also the fact that Trump pardoned a lot of people who were in prison for drug crimes.
Yes.
And a lot of people are very happy about that. And
Yeah.
a lot of people support Trump for that reason.
That's absolutely, and people saw the opposite with some of Kamala Harris's earlier policies, or their perception of them at least.
Do we have time for questions? I think if anyone has a question, otherwise, yes, ma'am?
They want to be able to hear it back home.
My name is Lakeisha Ashley. I'm actually a social worker and a student of medical cannabis science and therapeutics at the University of Maryland. My question is, after listening to everyone's discussion and kind of tying it all together in my head from a clinical health disparities, also a social disparities aspect, do you guys believe that there will ever be this connection where identifying that some of the social injustices or social issues then cause the health aspect where we do need cannabis? So in your pollings of what you're studying, do you ever believe that maybe the ballots need to frame question works around health disparities versus the criminal? Am I making sense? Because if we're utilizing cannabis in any kind of methods, right? So we're having health disparities, creating those social, economic kind of injustices.
Any thoughts on that? And like one thing we're seeing with the Path Caucus and psychedelics, they're purely focused on veterans and PTSD. And they're just keeping it focused right there has, made it very palatable to Republicans.
Yeah, so I'll start one time I was presenting to a group of backers on a ballot measure in a very conservative state, and they were trying to legalize medical marijuana, and someone asked, who is the base for this? And I just said, go find some random person on the street, and they're going to support medical marijuana legalization. They're your base. Everyone supports it. It's popular across the board. And we actually find in a lot of issues, like things like on gun safety, on a wide variety of issues, that healthcare is a great framing for this. It also goes back to what I was saying earlier about having good validators and about having defining it in the right way. Because yeah, that's absolutely a way to like, yes, veteran advocacy groups have been very helpful in a lot of places where we've moved forward on these policies on psychedelics and on marijuana.
I think also let's not forget our history, right? Like this movement, the whole cannabis legalization movement, I think what first started, some of my first things that really influenced my view on this was seeing AIDS patients getting dragged out by DEA, end of life, they couldn't walk and they were getting dragged out. And I think that influenced a lot of people. And then this dispensaries started to proliferate. People started to see, oh, my neighbor, boss, cousin, whomever, who I know has been suffering with this health issue is being able to be helped by cannabis. And that is what has made cannabis so overwhelmingly popular, right? And so I think that that's always been at its core. I think that, yes, it's not a snake oil. It's not going to fix everything for everyone. And we need to be careful not to overpromise that, but it's a medicine and it does help people.
Hey, what are you talking about? Go to your local dispensary. They can heal everything.
To add to, just to piggyback on that briefly, I know we don't have that much time, but like if you I don't know if you followed Nebraska's medical marijuana legalization. It's a very inspiring story about this mother who had a child who had an epilepsy, and and if you look at her, she gives off big mom vibes, and she has her son has an epilepsy, and the first time the state Supreme Court, there's also like, wish we could have talked about this, there's a big attack nationwide on ballot measures in part to defeat marijuana on legalization. But the first time, they said it violated the single subject law. The state Supreme Court said that. Second time, it didn't have the signatures. Just this last year, they passed it, and it was because the face of it was this mother with a child with epilepsy who's 12 years old or so, like around that. So, like I said about the validator.
Charlotte's Web, right? That little girl was 3 years old and she was having multiple seizures a day.
Yeah, I was just going to add that our polling before the election and after the election shows that there is a lot of bipartisan support when you frame drug policy reform from a public health lens. Like, people really respond to public health. And the three best validators from that framing are parents, law enforcement, and doctors. So good point.
We found nurses, but yeah, same, yeah.
Yeah, public health professionals
Yeah.
generally, doctors, nurses, that sort of profession.
One more question, or no, we're cut off. Feel free to talk to us afterwards, and I'm sure we're all very online, so track us down.
Yeah. I'm going to make a quick shout out. Go to the SSDP booth. We have an action alert. You can just scan it with your QR code. Send your legislators a letter telling them that we need them to act on cannabis. Please go do that now. It'll take you a minute.
Thank you so much.